Millionaire CEO couldn't perform for 10 years until he met the doctor. The truth will make you cry. 10 years since a woman he loved sat inside with folded papers in her hand, already preparing to walk away from a life he thought they were building together. He hadn't come here by accident tonight. His driver had offered to circle the block. Randy said no. He stepped out alone, coat buttoned too tight, hands buried in his pockets as if he could keep himself from shaking. This place wasn't just a hospital. It was the only address in the city where his success meant nothing, the only building that still had the power to stop him mid-stride. He had faced hostile takeovers, courtroom threats, global crises that bent entire markets. None of that made his legs feel as heavy as they did now. He told himself he was just passing through the neighborhood. But the truth was simpler. He had come to stand where he once failed and see if it still hurt. The glass doors didn't swing open when he stopped in front of them. They waited, silent, turning the building into a mirror. Randy barely recognized the man looking back at him. The tailored coat, the watch worth more than most people's cars, the posture drilled into him by boardrooms and negotiations, all of it screamed authority. This was the version of himself the magazines loved, the one investors trusted with their money and strangers trusted with their future. But the reflection stopped there. His eyes were empty in a way wealth couldn't disguise. No spark, no urgency, just fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep. A younger Randy once believed success would change how he felt when he looked at himself. That one day the reflection would finally nod back in approval. Instead, every year added another layer of polish to the outside, while sanding the inside down to nothing. The doors opened briefly as someone exited, and for a moment he could see the lobby behind the glass. Clean floors, soft lighting, quiet order. He didn't step forward. The doors slid shut again, restoring the image of a man who had everything and felt almost nothing. He adjusted his cuffs, not because they were crooked, but because it gave his hands something to do besides admit the truth. He didn't like the person staring back at him. People who worked with Randy liked to say he never hesitated. Contracts were signed in minutes. Decisions were made before others finished their questions. If a crisis hit, he was already 5 steps ahead. Tonight, he couldn't take one. The distance between the curb and the front door was no more than a few yards, yet his body refused to treat it like ordinary ground. His weight shifted from heel to toe, then back again, a small, useless motion that changed nothing. He told himself he was tired, that it had been a long day, that this was foolish, standing outside a building, frozen by a memory no one else in the city even knew belonged to him. Still, his feet wouldn't move. It was easier to oversee a corporation than to step into a place where he once chose a deal over a woman who needed him. Easier to manage thousands of employees than to face the one decision that had never left him. Every instinct he had trained into himself said push forward, solve the problem, move on. But this wasn't a problem that yielded to pressure. This was where momentum ended. And for the first time in years, Randy Smith, the man who ran half the world's shipping routes, was standing still. If someone had told Randy years ago that success could charge interest, he would have laughed it off. He believed in effort, discipline, reward. You worked harder, you got more. That was the deal. But standing here, he wondered how many people had paid a similar price without noticing it at first. How many viewers listening right now had climbed towards something they wanted, a career, a title, a better life, only to realize too late that the climb itself had pushed everything else out of reach. Maybe it wasn't a dramatic collapse. Maybe it was subtle, missed dinners, unreturned calls, promises that stayed promises because the calendar never slowed down enough to keep them. You don't wake up one morning and say, I chose this over that. You just wake up one morning with more achievements than connections. Randy hadn't lost his marriage in a single mistake. He traded it away in small, reasonable pieces. The kind no one warns you about when you're being congratulated. Success didn't rob him, it built him. Randy used to measure time in quarters and fiscal cycles. Every delay had a label that made it sound responsible. Expansion phase, market window, short-term sacrifice. At first, it really was only supposed to be a few months. He told Carissa the pressure would ease once the new contract settled, once the company stabilized, once the board stopped hovering. There was always a reason that sounded intelligent and temporary. But calendars don't care about intentions. Months stacked quietly into years, and before he knew it, the life he kept postponing had learned how to go on without him. He hadn't meant to miss that much. No one ever does. The most dangerous lie he told himself wasn't about money or growth. It was about time. He believed he had plenty of it. Everyone has at least one address they refuse to revisit. It might be a restaurant that closed after a breakup, a street where a friendship ended, or a house that no longer feels like home. For Randy, it was this entrance. He hadn't driven past St. Vincent's in a decade, not because it was inconvenient, but because it reminded him of a version of himself he didn't recognize anymore. The man who heard someone he loved needed him and still chose to stay where he was. Avoiding the building didn't erase the moment. It only made it harder to admit that the hurt had never left. He could outrun competitors. He couldn't outrun memory. So he stayed away, not out of fear of the place itself, but out of fear of what it would ask him to remember. For years, Randy framed his story as endurance. He told himself he survived pressure most people couldn't handle, that holding everything together had required a toughness few were built for. Standing here now, he finally saw the flaw in that narrative. He hadn't lost his marriage because he was incapable of love. He lost it because he trained himself to ignore it. Every time he chose another meeting over another moment, he didn't feel weaker. He felt disciplined, commended even. Ambition doesn't announce itself as a threat. It dresses like responsibility. It pretends to be loyalty to a goal that sounds noble. By the time he understood the cost, the bill had already come due. From the outside, Randy's life looked like a victory parade. Articles praised his leadership. Conferences requested his presence. People who had never spoken to him used his name as shorthand for achievement. Yet none of that followed him home. He could fill auditoriums and still eat dinner alone. He could negotiate deals that reshaped markets and still have no one to tell about his day. Every professional win arrived cleanly packaged, untouched by the mess of personal connection. It was possible to be everywhere that mattered publicly while vanishing privately. That was the problem no quarterly report ever mentioned. After Carissa left, nothing dramatic happened. No scenes, no public collapse, just a gradual dimming he didn't bother to name. At first he told himself he was too busy to date, then that he no longer needed to. Eventually he stopped noticing the difference. Invitations went unanswered. Conversations became transactional. He built walls so efficiently that he forgot they were there. 10 years passed like that, not in pain exactly, but in absence, as if part of him had stepped aside to let the rest keep functioning. From the boardroom, everything looked fine. From inside, something essential had gone quiet. He wouldn't have scheduled a visit himself. It was his assistant who insisted, quietly blocking out an hour on a calendar already crowded with obligations. Randy treated it like any other courtesy appearance. No expectations, no intention of staying longer than necessary. But the doctor didn't greet him with awe or deference. No mention of stock prices, no polite praise disguised as professionalism. She studied him for a moment and said, simply, that he looked like someone who had been alone for a very long time. It wasn't an accusation. It was recognition. That was the first time in 10 years anyone had spoken to him without the filter of his reputation, and the first moment he felt something shift. Randy went into that office convinced there was nothing left to say about his life. The facts were settled, the choices made. He expected conversation, not discovery. What he didn't expect was the relief that followed when someone finally named what he couldn't. The doctor didn't describe him as damaged or beyond repair. She spoke about exhaustion, about habits built for survival that outlived their purpose, about how people sometimes don't lose themselves. They store themselves away, waiting for a safer season. For years, Randy had treated his emptiness as proof that something inside him had failed. Instead, he began to wonder if it had only been buried. There was no dramatic promise of a cure, no tidy explanation of how long it would take or what it would cost. What the doctor offered instead was a reason to stay with the story. She told him that the distance he felt from his own life wasn't a life sentence. It was a pattern, one that had started long before that night at the hospital and had simply never been questioned. Randy walked out of the office carrying something unfamiliar, curiosity about himself. If he could understand how he had learned to disappear, maybe he could learn how not to. And if you've made it this far into his story, it's probably because some part of you is asking the same thing. If you've ever looked back on a choice and realized it cost more than you expected, this story isn't just about Randy. It's about the version of you that once meant to show up, before the schedule filled, before the priorities shifted, before the people who mattered learned to live without you. If that sounds familiar, this is your space. Subscribe to the channel and stay with stories that aren't here to impress you, but to remind you of parts of yourself you may have set aside. There's a moment in every life when later quietly becomes never. Not because you chose it, but because you assumed there would always be another chance. If you've ever promised yourself you'd fix things when work slowed down or reach out when life became easier, pause here for a second. Like the video, if you've ever delayed something that mattered and felt the weight of that delay long after the calendar moved on. Sometimes the smallest action is how you tell yourself you're still paying attention. Randy Smith was not the loudest executive in the room, but he was the one people waited for. Smith Core Logistics had started as a modest freight operation with 3 leased trucks and a rented office that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. In less than a decade, it had become a web of routes stretching across ports, highways, and distribution hubs most people never thought about until something arrived late. That was Randy's genius. He didn't chase attention. He built systems so efficient no one noticed them unless they failed. By 42, he was advising government agencies on infrastructure flow. Airlines asked for his input. Startups tried to copy his process, never quite understanding how he made complex operations look routine. Colleagues described him as composed, methodical, reliable under pressure. When deals stalled, they called him in. When markets shifted overnight, they waited to see what he would do before making their own moves. He had become a reference point, the quiet measure of how far a person could go without ever raising their voice. To the world, Randy Smith hadn't just succeeded, he had mastered momentum. Randy spent most of his days in rooms designed to impress, marble conference tables, glass walls, city views curated to suggest control over everything below. His calendar moved with him across time zones, each flight a capsule where he could prepare for the next negotiation without interruption. On planes, people spoke in lowered voices around him. In boardrooms, seats were adjusted before he arrived. The atmosphere changed when he entered a space. None of that followed him home. The penthouse was pristine in the way hotel suites are pristine, untouched, interchangeable, carefully emptied of evidence that a real life took place there. At night, the windows framed the skyline like a screensaver, endless motion that never entered the room. There were no unfinished projects on the counter, no shoes kicked off near the door. Silence settled immediately after he closed it behind him, thick and complete, as though the apartment had been waiting all day to be alone again. Randy would set his phone down and realize there was no one who expected to hear from him before morning. It hadn't always been this quiet. Randy still remembered how Carissa moved through that same space when it belonged to both of them. She never wore slippers, even in winter, padding across the floor with a mug balanced between her palms like it was something fragile. She sang to herself when she thought no one was listening. Not full songs, just fragments she stitched together from memory. He used to catch her in the kitchen mid-note, smiling at the absurdity of it, and she would laugh and change the melody just to annoy him. The apartment had once carried the soft disorder of a shared life, grocery lists written on scrap paper, jackets draped over chairs, mornings that began with conversation instead of headlines. Back then, the rooms didn't echo. They held her voice. The changes hadn't arrived all at once. They came disguised as obligations that sounded important enough to excuse almost anything. First, it was a birthday dinner postponed because a client arrived early. Then an anniversary reduced to a rushed lunch between calls. Trips that moved from the calendar to the apology list. Randy kept track of numbers better than moments. He could recall revenue growth down to the decimal, yet struggled to remember the last full weekend he'd spent at home without checking his phone. Carissa didn't accuse him. She adjusted, celebrated quietly, stopped circling dates on the fridge. And that was the most dangerous part. By the time he noticed the absence of complaint, the distance had already learned how to survive on its own. Randy had a narrative ready whenever doubt crept in. This phase is critical. Just get through this quarter. Once the next expansion settles, things will slow down. He repeated it so often, it stopped sounding like reassurance and started sounding like strategy. He told himself that real partners understood sacrifice, that Carissa knew what he was building and why it mattered, that she wouldn't trade long-term security for short-term comfort. Pressure in his mind wasn't a warning. It was proof he was doing something worthwhile. So he absorbed it without complaint, unaware that the story he kept telling himself was slowly replacing the one they were meant to share. Carissa never asked for upgrades. She didn't want larger closets or better reservations. When Randy brought home expensive gifts as substitutes for time, she thanked him without excitement and set them aside like objects that didn't quite belong. What she asked for was simpler and harder. She wanted him to listen without checking his phone, to finish a meal before answering messages, to sit with her on the couch without turning the silence into a work session. Once, while unpacking a bracelet he'd bought in Paris between meetings, she said, gently, that she would trade every nice thing they owned for one ordinary evening where he didn't have to leave early. Randy kissed her forehead and promised it would happen soon. Soon never arrived. The distance between them didn't explode. It stretched. They still shared space, still exchanged updates about schedules and logistics, still moved around each other with practiced coordination. On the surface, nothing appeared broken. Yet conversations grew efficient, trimmed of anything that wasn't necessary. Laughter became rare enough to feel noticeable when it happened. Their lives ran in parallel rather than together. Randy sensed the change but avoided defining it. Naming the problem would have required time he no longer knew how to give. So he let the quiet expand, believing it would correct itself. Instead, it settled in, steady, patient, waiting for the moment it would no longer need to be explained. The deal had been drifting for months, circling itself through time zones and legal teams like a storm that refused to land. A merger of this scale didn't hinge on one signature. It depended on timing, optics, leverage, and a willingness to wait until everyone else was exhausted. That night, Randy was the only one in the room who looked calm. The conference table was lined with executives flown in from 3 countries, their laptops glowing under recessed lights, their voices threaded with fatigue and ambition in equal measure. Charts flickered across the screen, forecasting growth in corridors no one in the room would ever physically see. This agreement would redefine SmithCore's footprint across 2 continents. It would turn competitors into footnotes. It would lock his company into the infrastructure of trade itself. For Randy, it was the culmination of years spent proving he belonged at tables like this, not as a guest, but as the person everyone waited on before they spoke, and he was ready to close. The vibration of his phone barely registered at first. It was buried beneath documents, swallowed by conversation, nothing more than a muted insistence against polished wood. When he finally glanced down, the number wasn't one he recognized. He hesitated, eyes flicking to the faces around the table, all of them poised mid-discussion, waiting for his next directive. He stepped out into the hallway and answered. The voice on the other end was tight, controlled, practiced at keeping panic out of professional spaces. Carissa's assistant introduced herself and explained that Carissa had collapsed at work. She was conscious now, being examined, but they were at St. Vincent's and running tests. Randy leaned against the wall, listening to details he didn't quite absorb, the kind that sound technical enough to be reassuring. When the call ended, the corridor was empty again, and the meeting was still waiting for him. He didn't return to the room immediately. The hallway outside the boardroom was narrow, lined with framed statements about company values he had approved without reading closely. Leadership, commitment, vision, words that sounded solid until they were tested. St. Vincent's was 20 minutes away, less with traffic in his favor. The contract on the table represented years of work, his, theirs, everyone who had hitched their future to the momentum of SmithCore. Randy pictured the hospital waiting area only in fragments, plastic chairs, quiet voices, a place where decisions were made slowly and rarely by people who liked control. The boardroom was the opposite. Here, urgency was an asset. He checked the time, calculated the window he would need to step out and still return before the momentum shifted. The part of him trained to optimize saw a solution forming. He could finish this first, just this once. When he stepped back into the room, every conversation paused on instinct. Someone slid a document toward his place at the table. Another adjusted a slide as if anticipating his next question. Randy picked up his phone and sent a brief message to his assistant, asking her to relay that he would head to the hospital shortly. Then, without looking at the screen, he spoke to the woman who had called him minutes earlier. "Tell them I'll come as soon as I can." The words felt responsible, measured, the kind of sentence that promised care without disrupting momentum. The meeting resumed, figures changing, objections dissolving under pressure, and with each passing minute, that sentence drifted further away from what it had been meant to mean. Time stopped behaving normally after that. What should have taken minutes stretched into debates over clauses that only existed to satisfy egos. Coffee appeared. Someone ordered food no one touched. Outside the windows, the color of the sky shifted without anyone remarking on it. Randy kept his phone face down. Not out of discipline, but because looking at it felt like inviting a complication he had already decided to postpone. There was always one more detail that required his attention, one more person who wanted reassurance, one more round of language tightening that seemed necessary for a deal this large. By the time the final document was passed around, his watch no longer matched the urgency he had felt earlier. The world had moved on without him noticing. The hospital lobby was quiet in the way only late hours can manage. Chairs sat in neat rows, their vinyl surfaces catching the overhead light without reflecting anything back. A television murmured to no one in particular. Randy approached the desk and gave Carissa's name, expecting to be directed down a hall or toward a curtained room. Instead, the nurse glanced at the computer and said she'd already been discharged. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for the answer to change. It didn't. The waiting area was empty, not a single coat draped over a chair, not a single sign that anyone had been there on his behalf. He had arrived after the part of the night that required him. He found her sitting in a side hallway, paperwork folded carefully in her hands as though she'd rehearsed the gesture. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright for a conversation that no one wanted to have. Carissa looked up when she heard his steps, not with relief but with a calm that made his stomach tighten. "You didn't have to come," she said. Randy started to explain. Traffic, meetings, the way everything had taken longer than planned. She raised a hand, not to interrupt him but to spare him. "I didn't need a CEO tonight," she said. "I needed my husband." There was no accusation in her voice, just clarity, and it was more devastating than anger would have been. Randy followed her out to the parking lot in silence. She opened the trunk of her car and lifted out a single suitcase, small enough that it could pass for a weekend trip. He watched her set it on the pavement and realized there were no extra bags waiting inside. No hidden second load, just that one case and the thin envelope she placed on top of it. "I left a note," she said, as if explaining something ordinary. Later, standing alone in their apartment, he would unfold that page and find only a few lines written in her familiar hand. Not an argument, not a list of complaints, just a sentence about loving him, followed by another about how loneliness inside a marriage was harder than loneliness alone. He slipped the paper into his wallet without knowing why. It would stay there for the next 10 years. She didn't wait for a response. Carissa closed the trunk, took a breath that looked more like relief than heartbreak, and got into the driver's seat. The engine started. The headlights washed over him for a brief moment, then passed. Randy stood where he was. He didn't call out, didn't reach for the door, didn't even take a step after the car as it disappeared into traffic. He told himself it was respect, that she deserved space, that chasing her in a parking lot would only turn something private into something undignified. What he didn't admit, not then, was that he didn't know how to choose anything over the life he had already committed to, and so he let her go. Before we move forward, take a moment and think about the people you've asked to wait while you handled what felt important at the time. If you've ever believed someone would always be there when you finally slowed down, leave a comment below and share your experience. The decade after Carissa left should have been remembered as the golden era of Smithcore logistics. Competitors disappeared or were absorbed. Ports that once ignored his proposals now reshaped their infrastructure around his models. Trade publications ran features on the company's precision, its refusal to overpromise, its quiet habit of delivering exactly what it claimed. Randy's name stopped appearing only in business sections. Universities requested him as a guest speaker. Policy committees asked for his perspective on national distribution strategy. When shipping lanes faltered after global disruptions, it was his internal memos that quietly set the new standard. He became the person people cited when explaining how stability was built. From the outside, it looked like everything had gone right. With every professional milestone, something else grew quieter. Randy no longer felt the surge of anticipation he once had before major decisions. Success arrived without excitement, like mail delivered to an address that no longer meant anything personal. He slept well enough, ate when reminded, exercised because his doctor recommended it. Nothing was technically wrong, nothing required fixing, yet there was no sense of arrival, no relief in accomplishment. Meetings ended, flights landed, numbers rose, and he felt unchanged, as if life had learned how to pass through him without leaving a mark. At first, people still called. Old friends invited him to weddings he declined with polite regrets. Former colleagues tried to schedule dinners that were always pushed to the following month. Over time, the invitations thinned. He dated occasionally, introductions arranged through professional networks where conversations stayed safely on neutral ground. No one asked much of him, and he didn't offer more than was required. Connections became efficient, brief, courteous, forgettable. The people who had once known him before Smithcore had shaped his identity were slowly replaced by faces that never expected anything beyond availability and a reservation. When a relationship faded, There was no aftermath to manage. Only empty slots in a calendar that quickly filled themselves. The note traveled everywhere with him. It stayed folded into a shape that no longer remembered being flat, edges softened by years of being handled and returned to the same pocket. Sometimes he forgot it was there until a receipt brushed against it, or his fingers brushed paper instead of leather. He never opened it in public, not in airports, not in cars waiting outside offices, not between meetings. It belonged to a quieter version of himself that only existed when no one was watching. The words never changed, but the way they landed did. Some days they felt like a confession, other days like a warning he still hadn't learned to interpret. Randy would have struggled to explain this to anyone who asked, because unhappiness implies friction. It implies something to push against, something that demands attention. What he felt didn't. There were no breakdowns, no obvious suffering, no mornings where he couldn't get out of bed. His life functioned smoothly, like a machine that had learned to operate without feedback. If someone had offered to fix him, he wouldn't have known what to hand over. He wasn't in pain. He was vacant. The reminder appeared on Randy's calendar between a regional infrastructure review and a private call with the board. It didn't carry the language he usually associated with his commitments. No revenue codes, no initials of people he needed to impress. Just a name, a time, and an address that meant nothing to him. Dr. Hallie Harris. Randy didn't ask for the appointment. His assistant, Mara, had placed it there after weeks of carefully phrased suggestions that never quite felt like suggestions. She had been with him since SmithCorp still fit inside a single building, and she had developed a way of identifying problems long before he was willing to. At first, he assumed it was a logistical matter, perhaps a consultant recommended by legal, or someone retained by the board to advise on stress management. But when he opened the details, there were no attachments, no memos, no corporate branding. Only a note from Mara that read, "I think this might be useful." It was the kind of sentence she never wrote unless she meant it. Randy closed the calendar entry without responding. He didn't delete it, but he didn't accept it either. He simply allowed it to exist, suspended in the same category as everything else he hadn't learned how to address. For the next 2 days, he pretended it wasn't there. By the morning of the appointment, the entry had migrated in his mind from curiosity to irritation. He stood in his office, jacket already on, watching the city through the glass while his phone buzzed with updates he actually wanted. Market shifts, staffing issues, the kind of messages that rewarded immediate attention. The address for Dr. Harris sat below them, unchanged, unremarkable, asking for nothing but an hour he didn't believe he could afford. He hovered over the option to remove it from his schedule. The rationales formed easily. There was a call he could move up, a flight he could take earlier, a meeting that would justify rescheduling with a polite apology and no explanation. Mara knocked once before entering, carrying a tablet with a day's agenda already arranged around the hour he was about to erase. "You're still on for this," she said, not as a question. Randy considered offering the reasons he'd rehearsed. Instead, he glanced at the time and nodded, a decision made less from intention than from momentum. He didn't want to go, but he didn't cancel. Dr. Hallie Harris's office occupied the second floor of a building Randy had passed hundreds of times without noticing. No lobby announcements, no reception desk that knew his name before he said it, just a quiet hallway and a door that opened when he knocked. She didn't stand when he entered, didn't reach for his hand or glance at a screen that might contain his resume and bullet points. "Mr. Smith," she said, closing the folder in her lap as if it had never been open. "Please, sit wherever you like." The room didn't carry the markers of prestige he'd learned to expect from professional spaces. No awards on the walls, no framed headlines. A small plant near the window leaned toward the light, unbothered by the absence of ceremony. Randy took the chair across from her and waited for the introduction that usually followed his name. It never came. Dr. Harris looked at him for a long moment, not assessing, not admiring, just noticing. "You look like someone who has been alone for a very long time," she said. The sentence landed without force, and somehow without permission. Randy had been in rooms where every movement he made was catalogued. He had grown used to conversations that bent around his preferences before he voiced them. Influence was a current he could usually feel before it carried anything. Here, there was none. Dr. Harris didn't adjust her posture to match his. She didn't offer validation disguised as professionalism. She waited in a way that didn't invite him to perform. He mentioned SmithCorp out of habit, offering the name as context the way he always did. She nodded once, not dismissive, not impressed, and asked him how he spent his evenings. The question caught him off balance. It didn't relate to productivity or strategy. It belonged to a part of life he had stopped inventorying. For the first time in years, his status failed to move the conversation. At first, he answered the way he always did, efficiently. He talked about growth metrics, leadership philosophy, how complex operations required discipline. He outlined his days as though he were presenting to a board, not sitting across from someone who had asked him about his evenings. Dr. Harris didn't interrupt. She listened until the pattern became obvious even to him. Every explanation curved back toward function. Nothing stayed with how it felt. "So what happens when the day is over?" she asked. The room seemed to narrow around the question. Randy opened his mouth and stopped. For once the rehearsed language didn't appear. He stared at the floor and said something he hadn't planned. "I don't go anywhere," he said. "I just exist." The words surprised him as soon as they left. He felt them open a space he had kept sealed for years. He told her about the apartment that felt like a hotel, about dinners eaten without noticing the taste, about carrying a note he never reread but never discarded. There was no rush in how he spoke, only a growing sense that he had been waiting a long time for someone who wouldn't translate his life into achievements. He talked until he was out of context, out of explanations, out of defenses. Dr. Harris waited until he finished, then leaned back slightly, as if giving his words room to remain in the space between them. "You didn't stop caring," she said. "You just decided you couldn't afford it." Randy lifted his eyes, unsure what she meant. "When people build something big, they often treat need like a weakness," she continued. "They learn to function without asking anything of anyone. Over time, that discipline turns into isolation." She paused, then added quietly, "You didn't fail because you lacked love. You failed because you forgot. You were allowed to need it." The sentence didn't accuse him. It clarified him. He felt something loosen in his chest, not relief exactly, but recognition, as if a language he'd forgotten was being spoken again. They didn't wrap the session with conclusions or commitments. Dr. Harris glanced at the clock and told him their hour was up, as though time were simply another boundary to respect, not a cue to extract meaning. Randy stood, expecting the familiar urge to leave quickly, to replace reflection with movement. It didn't come. Instead, he lingered near the door, his hand resting on the frame while he searched for a reason not to return. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this," he said. "You don't have to do anything yet," she replied. "Just don't disappear from it." He nodded once, not trusting himself with more. As he stepped into the hallway, he surprised himself by asking when her next opening was. Randy didn't notice the pattern at first. He only knew that Thursdays began to feel different. The sessions settled into his week without announcing themselves, a fixed point he stopped trying to justify. At the beginning, he treated them like briefings. He arrived with mental bullet points, ready to summarize progress as though there were quarterly results to review. Dr. Harris never asked for that. She asked about the pauses between things, about moments that didn't lead anywhere useful, about how his body reacted when his phone went silent instead of buzzing with instruction. Over time, the hours stopped feeling like an obligation. It became a boundary that protected a part of his life from efficiency. He would leave the building and notice details he usually dismissed, the sound of footsteps not belonging to him, the texture of the sidewalk under his shoes, the fact that the afternoon could exist without asking him to manage it. It wasn't improvement. It was awareness. And awareness, he was learning, was uncomfortable. The first time he closed his office door before 6, it felt like an error. His calendar was still full. There were calls that could have been taken, documents that would have benefited from his attention. He stood in the hallway with his briefcase in hand, waiting for the wave of urgency that usually followed any deviation from routine. It never came. Instead, there was a strange lightness in his chest, as if he had miscalculated the weight of the world and found it manageable. He took the elevator down without checking his phone and stepped outside while the day still belonged to people who weren't in a hurry. At home, the apartment didn't transform into something warmer. It was the same space it had always been. The difference was that he was inside it at an hour that allowed the quiet to feel like possibility rather than absence. He began to repeat the experiment. Once a week, then twice, Eventually, leaving before dark stopped feeling like an apology and started feeling like a choice. Cooking had never been part of Randy's life. Meals had always arrived ready, predictable, cleanly portioned. Heat came from machines, not from attention. Now he stood in front of a stove, rereading instructions like someone learning a foreign language too late to speak it fluently. More than once he scraped food into the trash, the smell of char clinging to the air longer than he expected. He ate anyway. The point, Dr. Harris had said, wasn't competence, it was participation. So he sat at his table with uneven plates, chewing slowly, noticing the absence of conversation without trying to replace it. There were evenings when he caught himself checking the clock out of habit, measuring the silence as though it were something he had failed to fill. He stayed in the room until the dishes were done. It was the longest he had remained with himself in years. Progress didn't feel stable. It felt borrowed. Randy worried that the version of himself learning to slow down was temporary, a brief intermission before ambition reclaimed its territory. He had lived inside habits long enough to know how easily old patterns returned when no one was watching. He told Dr. Harris that he didn't trust the quiet, that it seemed fragile, like something that would collapse the moment pressure returned. "What happens when I vanish again?" he asked one afternoon. She didn't correct him. She asked where he went when he vanished. The answer unsettled him more than the question. Dr. Harris didn't offer strategies. She offered attention. When Randy described moments where his mind left the room, halfway through dinner, mid-sentence, during a phone call, she didn't call it avoidance. She called it practice. "Notice the exit," she said, "not to stop it, but to see it." So he began to mark the instant he wanted to withdraw, the tightening in his chest when silence lingered too long, the reach for his phone when a thought grew uncomfortable. He didn't correct the impulse, he named it, and naming it made it slower. Staying, he learned, wasn't dramatic. It was a series of decisions so small they barely felt like decisions at all. If any part of Randy's story feels familiar, the way achievement quietly replaces connection, take a moment and think about what your own version of success has cost you. Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes naming it is the first way back. The realization arrived without ceremony. Randy was midway through describing a minor conflict at work. Nothing urgent, nothing heavy, when he stopped himself. He wasn't filtering anymore. He wasn't measuring his words to avoid discomfort or hide behind competence. He was simply talking. That alone felt like evidence. "I think I might be ready to stop coming," he said, the thought surprising him as much as her. Dr. Harris didn't respond immediately. She waited, not to create drama, but to allow the statement to remain intact without being rescued. "Tell me what that means to you," she said. Randy searched for the right phrasing and found none. He only knew that the sessions no longer felt like emergency care. They felt like maintenance, valuable, steady, but no longer essential to keep him upright. "I don't feel repaired," he said, "but I don't feel lost anymore." For the first time, that distinction mattered. The last session ended without the rituals he had expected. No formal summary, no speech about growth, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. Randy walked with Dr. Harris to the door, each step slower than the one before it. The hallway outside her office was empty, its stillness unfamiliar now that it wasn't simply a waiting area. They stood there longer than necessary, both aware that the boundary between them had changed and unsure how to name it without altering it again. "This doesn't feel like an ending," Randy said at last. Dr. Harris smiled, not as a clinician, but as someone who understood the weight of the moment. "It feels like the first honest hello," she replied. "They didn't schedule it." There was no exchange of numbers, no agreement spoken out loud. Yet the next week, when Randy passed the small cafe on the corner, he slowed without realizing why. Through the window, he saw Dr. Harris seated at a narrow table, a mug cradled between her hands as she read something she wasn't rushing to finish. He hesitated at the door, then stepped inside. They spoke at first about nothing in particular, the weather turning earlier than expected, the unpredictability of foot traffic in that neighborhood. Only after the cups were half empty did the conversation find its way toward something more personal. It felt different from therapy. There was no frame to hold it steady, no expectation of resolution. just two people discovering how to speak when neither was responsible for the other. They were careful in ways neither had ever needed to be before. Randy didn't present himself as someone who needed saving, and Hallie never positioned herself as the one with answers. Their time together unfolded without urgency, walks that ended when conversation did, not when the schedule demanded it. He spoke about his past without turning it into a story with a moral. She shared parts of her own life that had nothing to do with helping him. There was relief in the symmetry of it. What connected them wasn't the work they had done in that office. It was the decision to meet each other without tools. No one was fixing anyone. They were simply staying. Randy didn't mark the change on a calendar. There was no date he could point to and say, "This is when everything shifted." What he noticed instead were the small rearrangements of his days that accumulated into something steadier than ambition had ever been. Mornings began without screens. He sat at the kitchen table with coffee that was still too strong and toast that was often too dry, listening to the building wake up around him. Doors opened down the hall. Someone laughed on a balcony. The city entered the room without asking him to manage it. He walked more, not for exercise, but for distance from the velocity that had once driven him. Routes changed, not because he needed variety, but because he no longer treated the shortest path as the only one that mattered. Evenings settled into a rhythm that didn't depend on achievement. Some nights he cooked, others he didn't. The consistency wasn't in the activity, but in the way he allowed time to remain open rather than occupied. Life stopped feeling like a series of obligations he needed to outrun. It began to feel like something he could step into at his own pace. The phone had once been an extension of his hand, its weight familiar enough that he sometimes reached for it even when it wasn't there. Now it rested face down at the edge of the table, silent unless he decided otherwise. Dinner was no longer an intermission between calls. It had shape, the sound of utensils, the pause before speaking, the unspoken permission to finish a thought without interruption. Randy noticed how often he had used distraction as protection. If a moment felt uncertain, he replaced it with motion. If a conversation deepened, he redirected it toward something safe. Without the device in his palm, those exits closed. What remained was presence, imperfect, occasionally uncomfortable, and more alive than anything he had scheduled. Work still mattered. Smithcore didn't dissolve, nor did his responsibilities evaporate. The difference was that his identity no longer ended where his job description did. He delegated without guilt. He left decisions unfinished when the hour asked for something else. He noticed the subtle relief that arrived when a problem belonged to a team rather than to him alone. Randy began introducing himself without his title when it wasn't required. In rooms where no one cared about his resume, he discovered how little of himself he had ever offered before. For the first time, the question, "Who are you?" didn't feel like an invitation to list accomplishments. It felt like permission to answer honestly. Randy didn't tell anyone where he was going that morning. He left his phone behind, not as a statement, but because he didn't want an interruption to pull him back into habits he had worked hard to soften. The sidewalk outside St. Vincent's hadn't changed in any meaningful way. The same flow of people moved in and out of the entrance with their own private reasons, their own lives unfolding behind expressions he couldn't read. He stood across the street for a moment, then crossed without pausing, the movement almost casual now. No weight in his legs, no argument with himself about whether he belonged there. This was no longer the place he avoided. It was the place he chose. He didn't go inside. Randy stopped at the edge of the steps and looked up at the doors as if they were an old acquaintance he was finally ready to address. "For a long time," he said quietly, not caring who might overhear, "I thought I was paying for a mistake." The words didn't shake. They landed with the steadiness of something that had been rehearsed in private. "I told myself I deserved the emptiness, that staying busy was the only way to make it right." He exhaled, feeling the truth in his chest rather than his head. "I wasn't being strong," he added. "I was keeping myself on probation." Hallie stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, the space between them unguarded. "You weren't paying for a mistake," she said. "You were repeating it." Randy turned to her, uncertain. "You didn't choose silence because you believed in it," she continued. "You chose it because it felt familiar. It was the same decision, made in a different shape." She let the thought rest, then offered him something gentler. "You don't have to keep proving that you're sorry. You can start showing that you're here. Later, The light in the apartment felt different. It spilled across the floor without asking him to measure it, touching the edges of the room that had once felt more like a waiting area than a home. Windows stood open just enough to let the sounds of the city drift inside. Footsteps below, someone laughing in the distance, a car door closing with finality. Randy moved through the space without hurry. He set a book down where he could find it again. He left a mug in the sink and didn't feel compelled to correct the small disorder. Hallie leaned against the counter, watching him as though this quiet choreography were its own kind of conversation. For the first time, the apartment didn't feel staged. It felt lived in. They sat together on the couch, the day easing around them without demand. Randy looked at the light on the wall, at the way the room held still long enough for him to notice it, and smiled. Not the practiced version he had used for years, but something simpler. For the first time in 10 years, he said, "I'm not surviving anymore, I'm living. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a choice you've been postponing or a moment you've been carrying quietly, stay connected with us. Subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime so you don't miss the next story about real lives, real turning points, and the moments that finally change everything."